Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is Steve Lubetkin, an award-winning professional podcaster. He spent more than 30 years on corporate PR and print and business journalism, and for the past 19 years, he's been producing podcasts for other people and podcasters. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Alex. Thanks for having me.
So you're an expert on podcasts, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are wondering, how do you go about creating a new podcast?
So podcasting has been around for close to 20 years now. Actually, I tell people I've been doing it since I was a teenager, making pretend radio shows in my parents' basement, way back in the days of analog magnetic recording tape. And things have changed a lot because back then there was no way to let anybody hear what we were recording and playing with. Today, obviously, we have the ability to distribute things over the net. So I began doing this after leaving corporate in 2004, 2005, and found a need for people to be able to make podcasts for corporate clients who wanted to take advantage of the technology but didn't really know how to do it. So the first thing we need to do is have some kind of a recording platform. And there are a wide range of platforms that people can try that are free or low cost. And as you get into it and get more experience, you probably want to do a little bit more with it. And so there are more sophisticated platforms as you go up the scale, depending on how sophisticated you want to get and how expensive you want to get. So we start with a recording platform that allows you to record digitally instead of on magnetic recording tape like I used to. And then you need a microphone, obviously, to talk into, like the one you have. And you need some kind of a device to get the recording from the microphone into the recording platform. And typically that's some kind of a mixer or a digital interface that connects to the computer where you're doing the recording. One of the things I like to do when we go on location is to not depend on a computer like a laptop to be the recording platform. I like to have a dedicated device, either a digital audio recorder or a digital mixing board that can record, because it's single purpose and it's reliable. But I've always found a tendency for computers to decide it's time to do an update of Windows right in the middle of a critical recording. And so we want to try and avoid that if we can. And then the addition of music and special effects, if you're going to use them, which comes at the end when you're doing your post-production. There are some newer tools which we're playing with and I'm pretty excited about that allow you to edit audio and video podcasts by looking at a transcript of the audio and video and actually editing the words from the transcript, which then automatically edits the audio track to correspond to the transcript. And that seems to be a pretty good time saver for a lot of the work and in terms of doing the first cut of edits. Programs like Descript are able to identify filler words like and ah and and automatically delete them all. So those kinds of tools are available. And a lot of the platforms that people are using for remote recording, which increasingly are important since the pandemic, a lot of the work has gone remote. And we're recording this obviously remotely on StreamYard. And there are other platforms like StreamYard that let you record in the cloud, but getting a recording that's high quality from the guests who are on the show with you, because it's being recorded locally on their computer and then uploaded. And that makes a big difference and looks a lot better and sounds a lot better than the typical Zoom recordings that many people are accustomed to using.
So how would you rank these various elements in order of importance? It seems like, generally speaking, corporate podcasts tend to invest a lot in audio quality equipment, fancy graphics, or music effects, but many of them don't actually say anything interesting. So what should people prioritize and how should they plan a way to make the podcast interesting to listeners?
So the idea is to make the conversation interesting. And there's also a tip that the trainers who train people for media interviews use, and that is you not only want someone willing to appear, but excited to appear and enthusiastic. So you want to look for guests who are excited and enthusiastic and able to tell a story in a way that is engaging and interesting to people. Now, corporate podcasts don't have to be uninteresting, and the information doesn't have to be useless, but they do want it to sound professional. And so we spend a lot of time working with those clients to get the lighting right, to get the microphones right, to get the sound and the look of it looking good so that it reflects their brand. And this is frankly true, I think, for even individual podcasters who may not be associated with a corporation or an organization. This is a way that you're putting forward your expertise, your knowledge, your thought leadership. And, you would not create your logo for your podcast by using a crayon on a cocktail napkin. You hire a graphic designer, you maybe dabble in graphic design yourself, but you produce something that you're proud of, something that puts a good foot forward. And I think the same is true of a podcast. It should certainly sound good. If it's video, it should look good, and you should strive for good quality audio and video. People will forgive a little bit of deterioration in the video, but if a podcast is hard to listen to because of bad sound, they're not going to stay around. It's hard to listen to if the sound is not good. And there are new tools coming out that are really quite useful to people who don't know how to do post-production sound editing and sound mastering that can help you do that and are big time savers. So those are the kinds of things that people should look into.
For what it's worth, I can say from my own experience that even if you don't have any of the fancy tools that audio engineers use, you go to Upwork.com, you find an audio engineer, and typically they're able to edit an episode for $40 or $50, and they do it really well.
I'm not a big fan of using those kinds of sites because there are literally hundreds of thousands of high-quality professionals who are struggling for work here in the United States. And, it's taking work that could be put with high-quality professionals and giving it to people that, may or may not be able to accomplish it. If you're having good experiences, that's great. But we're not big fans of those sites, and, those people will come after me, I'm sure.
And it's worth noting, my guy's in England. It's not like I'm outsourcing this to Bangladesh, right? Sorry if I'm offending anybody at Bangladesh. All right, so on the audio quality question, how do you handle this now that so many guests are remote and you can't quite control their audio setup? Are there any tips or tricks on how you can instruct your guests to have good audio?
What we do with a lot of the guests is we encourage them to either get a microphone, or for some of our clients are willing to have us send the microphones to their guests. And we'll drop ship microphones or headset microphones for audio podcasts to the guests, and we'll instruct them how to plug them in. We make sure that we know what equipment they have, if they're using a Mac or a Windows laptop, because the ports are often different. We need to make sure that the microphone connects properly to that particular machine. And we'll send them an earpiece like the one that I'm wearing so that they're not, appearing in a video with a big studio headset on. And we coach them through it. And we coach them on the lighting, and we coach them on the sound so that we get good quality sound, or at least get closer to good quality sound, which we can then enhance when we do the post-production. If you start with a good audio track, you can make it sound better. If you start with a bad audio track, you can make it sound okay. And the typical mistake that we always see people making is thinking that the built-in microphone in a laptop computer is adequate for this purpose. Because they're accustomed to using it for their Zoom calls or their Teams calls, and it's good enough, they don't realize the amount of noise that's introduced into the recording when you're using that microphone. That microphone is directly on top of the cooling fan in the laptop, so it's picking up the vibrations from the cooling fan. It is too far from your mouth to be effective at recording your voice. The typical distance you want the microphone to be is about a fist away from your mouth. And so what you get is you get the ambience of the room that they're in. And again, people are typically not in a sound-enhanced, acoustically secure room when they're doing these recordings. They're in their living room. They're in a room with very hard surface walls or glass walls, and it's reflecting sound and echoing all over the place. So it has the sound of as if you have your head in a wastebasket. And you don't want that. Ideally, you want the sound to be up close and personal so that when people are listening to it with headphones or earbuds, they're hearing at a constant, even level of audio from all of the people in the program. And that is a signal that the other thing you need to look at is the audio volume. Often people will have the volume set differently, and what we need to do in post-production is to make sure that those volume levels are normalized, is the word that audio engineers use. There are tools within the various recording programs that you can use, and some of the tools like the ones that you've been using that can enhance the sound, those can be used to normalize as well. So you want everybody to be at the same volume. You don't want people turning up the volume to hear one guest and then having their ears bleed because the next guest is too loud. So you want everything to be consistent. You want everything to sound good. And that's what, if you couple those things with guests who are entertaining and engaging, you'll have a podcast that people will want to listen to all the way through.
All right. And now the next step after that, we have a podcast that people want to listen to all the way through. Our sound is good. Maybe we even have good lighting and everything reflects well upon the brand. How do we find an audience?
Well, that's the $64,000 question for all podcasters, isn't it? One of the things, and Donna Papacosta and I wrote about this in our book, The Business of Podcasting, most podcasts will not get huge viral audiences. The large media companies that put the marketing muscle behind the most popular podcasts on the typical podcast platforms like Apple and Google are really producing broadcast radio and TV shows and simply not putting them up on the satellite to distribute to their affiliate stations. They're putting them on the internet and promoting them that way. So those shows are always going to rank much higher than the podcast by individuals. What you are really looking for is serving the audience that's interested in your content. And that can be a niche audience, and it can be a very highly engaged audience without being a very large audience. And so that's one of the reasons why in the book we discuss all the different ways that people think of monetizing their podcasts. Getting viewers, becoming viral is not one of them, because it generally doesn't succeed and it only frustrates podcasters. What you want to do is produce really good content, promote it on social media. Don't put it on social media. You should always have a website associated either with your brand in general, that where you put your podcasts, or a podcast-specific website for the program, which you then use to distribute the podcast to the various podcast directories and platforms. There are tools you can use, content distribution platforms, that automatically distribute the podcast to the multiple podcast places, where people get their podcasts. You don't need to do that manually. You can do that through a content platform and have it done automatically, and that's probably the best way. What you really want to have happen is to bring people back to your website where they can engage with the other content that you're providing, whether it's transcripts or show notes or stories about your guests or any other content that you want them to see. The idea of early on, people were using social media as the platform on which they distributed their podcast. You don't want to give up your audience to those platforms. They are like walled gardens, in my opinion. It's great to have stuff on Facebook, but try getting it out. It's a lot harder if you post it there first. If you post it on your website and provide a link through Facebook to your website, that's fine, because it gets people back to your website and away from Facebook. And that's really what you want. You don't want someone else controlling access to your content.
Right. So I want to ask you a bit about the ecosystem, because I was trying to figure out who are all the different types of podcasts, all the different players, and it seems a bit confusing. So we mentioned the corporate guys. For them, the podcast is probably a tool to promote something else. So they don't actually need to monetize it. They don't actually want people to stick around just for the podcast. They want to use the podcast as an entry point to then go ahead and maybe check out the product that the company has. We have various coaches and one-man shows that use the podcast as a self-promotion tools. Maybe they provide some useful information. They try to solve a problem for people, but ultimately it is there to promote them. And then there are the podcasts that normal people listen to, I think, most of the time, which are the Joe Rogans and Lex Friedmans and Chris Williamsons and Hubermans of the world, right? People who somehow became interesting just by talking about what they feel like talking about. Is there anybody I'm missing in this ecosystem? And if this is roughly the lay of the land, how do people become Joe Rogan?
Yeah. Well, again, I think those kinds of podcasts are really more specifically talk radio shows that simply are being distributed using the podcast technology because it's cool, it's fresh, it's new, and calling it a podcast gives it an aura that it wouldn't otherwise have if you just said it was a radio show. The kinds of things he's doing, the kinds of content he's generating, and people like him, it's not probably attainable by individuals working in podcasting by themselves. It's really being done by large media companies that produce these shows and are just taking advantage of the distribution channel. And so they have all of the marketing tools that those companies are able to use, whether it's buying likes or buying social media presence or buying advertising through Google Ads and other things. And they're using those typical promotion tools. For the vast majority of podcasters, the way to promote it is going to be to their circle of, family, friends, and followers, and let them know that it's out there. And it's a long haul, kind of a viral push to get people to tell other people about what it is you're doing. And it's going to appeal to a niche of people who are interested in that content. In terms of the corporate podcasters, you're right, a lot of them are using it as a way to promote products, but many of them have realized that promoting the product is not the best way to use this tool. The tool is best used as a way to introduce people to the knowledge and thought leadership that the company can provide. And the example I cite to people, we used to do some podcasts for a very large global insurance company that was not into personal life insurance or health insurance or home insurance, auto. They were insuring very complex business risks, and they felt the need to educate businesses, risk managers, about those particular risks. And when the company launched one of the very first cyber liability policies in 2006, they engaged us to produce a series of podcasts for them about cyber liability. And these were podcasts with the product manager for cyber explaining the things that most risk managers hadn't even dealt with before. Data breaches, malware, viruses, firewalls, and encryption, things that they hadn't had to think about. And he educated them about these things. And the value of that for the company was, instead of this product manager having to have individual telephone conversations with every person who was interested in that insurance, he was able to point them to a white paper on a landing page and say, listen to the podcast, download the white paper, and educate yourself, and then we'll be ready to help you. And the podcasts were downloaded about 13,000 times, and that's not large in the world of Joe Rogan and viral and large podcasts, but for that insurance company, the universe was probably not much larger than those 13,000 downloads of interest in that product. And so by not having to talk on the phone, that's 13,000 half hours that he didn't have to spend on the phone. And that's real money. When you're a product manager at a large insurance company and a vice president, there's a salary and there's benefits that accrue to your job. And if you're not spending the time, talking on the phone, saying the same thing over and over and over again, then you've got a valuable podcast there. And that's a home run for a company like that. For most individuals who are doing podcasting, I would encourage them to think of it as something that they do either to shine a light on their professional life, that they want to get people to engage their services, or from a hobby standpoint, and to talk about their passion projects and to engage people in those passions. And always think about who you can have on as a guest. Most podcasts don't do very well if it's just somebody talking, a single person, over a 20 or 30 minute period. It's just not engaging enough. Most of us are not that talented to carry a 20-minute show as a monologue. So it's always better to have someone to bounce things off of.
Well, I think that most of the people that have monologue type shows just enjoy listening to themselves, but maybe I'm generalizing.
I can't disagree with you. No, I think your hunch is exactly right.
All right. So going back to the corporate example, that's an interesting one because in some sense, using the podcast as a tool to get a message out there in a repeatable way, it competes with other tools that have been used for this purpose in the past. In the past, I could have written a series of blog posts or articles, or I could have gone on a conference, given a talk there, and then I could distribute the videos from that talk. So how does podcasting compare to these different media?
I think podcasting is a more intimate medium because it can be a conversation between two or more people. And so people listening to it are accustomed to the idea that it's just people talking with them, talking amongst themselves and conveying a message in just a more intimate way. If you record a speech at a webinar or a seminar, that's great. And people do watch those and it can be extremely useful. But if you have an opportunity for people to listen, to just listen to an expert on the topic, talk about what the company knows, what the company's experience has been in that particular subject area, it gives people a greater level of comfort. And it's almost like, going out for a cup of coffee with someone and saying, I really like the way he was talking about this stuff. He really knows his business. I want to do business with her. And so it's just a way of getting a little bit more intimate engagement with prospective clients and prospective customers to build up that trust that is really hard to build today. It's really hard to get people's attention. It's hard to get traditional media attention for what a company is doing. The stories are complicated. They don't lend themselves to network television. They barely lend themselves to local television in a market. And you're not necessarily reaching the people you want to reach. The other aspect of it, which we haven't talked about, is the search engine piece of it. And that is, Google and the other search engines still give higher scores to websites that have rich media, whether it's audio or video, on a consistent and a continuing basis. And people are not typically searching, whether they're using AI tools or using traditional search engines, they're not typically searching for the name of your company. They're not saying, hey, I have a problem, I need Joe's insurance company. What they're searching for is the problem and solutions to the problem. And to the extent that a company positions itself in the search so that its results are visible when people search for the problem, that's going to make the difference. When they are looking for who to do business with or who to ask about doing business with, I have questions, and who has the answers? And if they see the company because of the podcast, because of the video conversations, that's going to help that company break through the noise.
Right. It actually reminds me, granted, this wasn't a podcast, but I remember watching a talk somebody gave at Y Combinator, talking to the class of startup entrepreneurs that were there. And I ended up basically engaging with every single company he mentioned in that talk, because I was learning about a field that I know nothing about. Here's an expert that explained you can do it with this, this, and this. I ended up trying every single tool in there. So I don't even know if that guy worked for one of those companies. Probably yes. But it was definitely good. Like you mentioned, it was intimate. He was talking to a class of students and not just giving a show at a big conference. And it was convincing.
Yeah, I mean, and the show notes, which can include links to the companies and the products you talk about, can also be valuable, because if you're putting this on a website that you control, you can add all those additional things. You can add the white paper about the topic. So, you've produced the content for the podcast. You can also turn that into a transcript that people can download and read. Some people like to read. Everybody learns differently. We know from, the teaching about teachers, how teachers have to have different ways to work with different students. Everybody learns differently. Some people learn visually, so they want to look at a video and watch people's faces, or they want to look at diagrams. Some people want to read text. Some people like to listen to a lecture, and books on tape and podcasts, that's their thing. And if you provide this stuff in all those different versions, you can create a very rich experience for customers and prospective clients so that they get a sense, they get an aura of trust around your ability to explain and hopefully deal with the problem that they're trying to solve.
Now, I should mention, a couple of years ago, I saw a study which took the same text and provided it to people in the form of a transcript or a video or just the audio, and asked those people to rank the intelligence of the speaker. And the audio format resulted in the highest scores. So we sound smarter when we talk. When they see our face, we're a little bit less smart. And if somebody reads the transcript, then it's choppy because it was actually spoken language and not a well-written article. And so we sound less intelligent there.
Well, this reinforces the experience that people had in the very first of the presidential debates in 1960 when Richard Nixon was debating John F. Kennedy. And the people who listened on the radio thought that Nixon had a much more commanding presence than Kennedy. People who watched on television saw Kennedy, who had, deliberately gone under a sun tanning lamp to make his skin look healthier. Nixon had a bad cold or the flu, and he had a high fever, and he was pale and pasty. He declined to wear TV makeup. Kennedy was already bronzed from the sun and took more bronzing from the makeup artist. And so on TV, people thought that Kennedy won the debate. So it was very interesting, and it just bears out what you're saying. There are different ways that these mediums work, and it's important to be prepared for all of them to make sure that the message is right for all of them.
Right. Last question for the day. Where do you see this field evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you see it changing over time?
Well, I think we're already seeing a move in a lot of areas, and I don't necessarily agree with this, to a move to much shorter content. People tend to post very short videos on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram. It's kind of sad because there's a lot more useful content that could be explored in the longer form programs. And I think the longer form programs always will have a place, but I think that, again, audience attention spans have gotten shorter. So I think that you're going to see a lot more shorter content. Unfortunately, that's going to lend itself to looking more like a TV commercial, and I'm not sure if that is going to be as useful for the certainly the corporate and organizational users of podcasts as having a longer conversation. But we'll have to see how that shakes out.
So it's funny that you say that, because at least on the Joe Rogan side of things, podcasts have been getting longer and longer, and even shows that used to be typically 1 hour, like Modern Wisdom, are now routinely 3 hours, right? I think Lex Friedman went to 7.5 hours in his talk with Balaji Srinivasan. At least that's the longest one I've seen so far.
Well, and there are some history podcasts that go 3 or 4 hours, I believe.
Right. And so I actually find it hard that podcasts I used to like in the past, I still like them, but I don't have the time to listen to an entire episode anymore.
Well, and what I say to people when they ask me about the length of podcasts is, the prevailing wisdom is a podcast should be about 23 to 25 minutes because that was the average length of the typical commute to work. And the thinking was people would be driving to work or taking the train to work and listen to the podcast. Now, since the pandemic, almost nobody's got a commute like that. So that number is probably no longer valid. And the other thing to keep in mind is there is a stop or pause button on the player. And so if the podcast is longer because the content is good, people will stop and listen to it. And the example I would use there, we did a podcast some years ago on women's health, and it was a recording of an in-person seminar. The topic was new treatment modalities for ovarian cancer. And most people, when they hear ovarian cancer, they think it's automatically a death sentence, which it no longer is. And these speakers were medical professionals talking about how they could help women with ovarian cancer. And the recording was about 2.5 hours long. And at the time, this was when internet bandwidth, people's connections were not that great, and it took a long time to download stuff. And it was a very large file, the 2.5 hour podcast. And we got several thousand downloads. And the reason for that is when you have a topic that's compelling and critical to people, like God forbid you have to deal with a diagnosis like that, and you need every piece of information you can get your hands on. And people are willing to wait to download a very large podcast if it's compelling and important to them. So I would say to people who want to do a really long podcast, if it's really good information and it's something that people are asking for, begging for, go ahead. Why not?
Yeah, and I should mention, if you are trying to time it to the length of the average person's commute, for those listeners who do commute, please consider that nobody listens at 1x. I personally use 1.75x, but different people use different speeds, so you have to redo the math for that.
That sounds good.
All right, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and it's been very insightful.
Thanks very much, Alex. Great to be here.
This has been another episode of The Otherweb. Join us next time for more in-depth discussions about news, podcasts, and other forms of media.